Thank you very much for watching my film. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel as well, because I bring out a bikepacking film just like this every single month. The Way of the Roses is a 170-mile bikepacking route from coast to coast, from Morecambe in Lancashire, across the Yorkshire Dales, and then ending in Bridlington on the east coast of Yorkshire. It's a pretty popular ride, and it is pretty tough as well. The first couple of days especially are very difficult in terms of climbing, because you go over the Yorkshire Dales, which is known for being very steep and very hilly. It is an absolutely beautiful route, and it's been on my to-do list for a while, given that I don't live that far from elements of the route, and I've cycled around elements of it many times. So I was desperate to go and do it, and it was on my list for 2023. The vast majority of the Way of the Roses is doable on a road bike. 99% of it is on roads. Some bits take you off on sort of smooth tarmac or cycle network routes, but even so, you will be absolutely fine on a road bike for the vast majority. You start the route either in Morecambe, which is the most common place to start, or at Brid, and you can go obviously coast to coast, depending on which way that you're going to do it. I started at Morecambe, so I got the train from where I live in Yorkshire over to the west coast and started the route there. It was super easy to get the train over, and because it was northern trains the whole way, meant I didn't need to put my bike on, which was also fantastic. Now, I don't live too far from Selby, so that's where I got the train from. There was only one other person getting on the train at Selby, that's where it started. And funnily enough, he was also doing the Way of the Roses. It's that popular of a route. He didn't have his bike with him, but he was obviously meeting his friends to collect the bike and start from there. I can't remember your name, I'm really sorry. It was a while ago when I actually did the trip. But if you are the person I'm talking about, feel free to put your name in the comments. It'd be good to hear from you. So the route takes you from Morecambe through Lancaster into the Yorkshire Dales and then over to the coast that way. Day one, my plan was to go from Morecambe over to Pateley Bridge, which is in Nidderdale actually, just outside of the Yorkshire Dales. And I know that really well because I used to live not that far from there, and it's a beautiful place for cycling. Just outside of Lancaster, I actually bumped into another subscriber. It was Matt, who was cycling from Land's End to John O'Groats. Matt actually emailed me a few months before this trip because he was coming all the way from Australia to cycle up the country, and he wanted some tips after seeing my LeJog video. This is happening more and more. I seem to bump into subscribers quite a bit now when I'm out cycling, so that just reminded me really, if you are ever out and about and you see me, feel free to say hello. I love meeting subscribers and other cyclists going on adventures, so it'd be good to hear from you. Leave a comment, Matt. It'd be good to hear how your LeJog went. You were about halfway last time I saw you, so it'd be good to see how the rest of your trip went. Day one was really brutal. There was a lot of climbing, as you can probably imagine. Getting into the Yorkshire Dales was okay, sort of undulating terrain, few climbs here and there, but where it really got hard was entering Settle. Settle is one of those towns that's sort of a gateway to the Yorkshire Dales. It's very popular with tourists, and it was a great place to stock up, and it's also a great place to stay if you're going to do this over several days. I did the route over 3 days, so I did sort of 50-60 miles on average each day. So the first day took me to Pateley Bridge. I went through Settle, and then those climbs just hit you like a ton of bricks. It gets really challenging, very steep, and then you end up to the top of the Yorkshire Dales, where the weather tends to be very windy and always worse up there than it is everywhere else. I was absolutely fine all day, and the weather was pretty good for the vast majority of the day, but as I got to the top of Greenhow area, which is a very steep descent, there's actually warnings on the route map saying that you need to be careful on this bit because it does catch cyclists out, unfortunately, but I've been down that hundreds of times, so I know it very well. I got hit with a massive rainstorm, got absolutely soaked. My GoPro got soaked, and I also ended up with an ND filter on there, which I forgot to take off, and I obviously hadn't put it on properly, which meant that there was a little bit of water going into the lens, which fogged up the lens and made it pretty unusable for that entire section of the route. I stayed at the Talbot House B&B in Pateley Bridge, which was really nice. It was a very old building, but a really handy place to stay, and pretty reasonable as well, not too expensive. There were a lot of cyclists there. In fact, the owner said that 90% of the people that were staying there that day were cyclists. So there were a lot of hungry mouths to feed. That was quite obvious when I went into the bike storage room. There were bikes literally everywhere. Big group rides, father and son adventures, and then me by myself. So it was a really good place to stop. I'm glad I stayed at a B&B because the weather was pretty atrocious that evening. It was supposed to rain for a couple of hours, but I think it rained literally all night. I normally camp on these adventures at least once, and the fact that I was doing 2 nights, 3 days of cycling, I would normally camp on the second night. But because the route passes through York, and I mentioned previously I live near Selby, and that's very easy to get to from York, I just thought rather than finding a campsite, which I literally couldn't because it was bank holiday weekend, coronation weekend, so everything was booked up, or paying for a B&B, which was extortionate in York city centre, it was hundreds of pounds a night, I just thought, well, I'll just get the train back to Selby and then ride home from there, stay at my house and then rejoin the route the next day, which is exactly what I did. I'd always recommend if you live near a route, you may as well use your house as a stop-off point, or if you've got friends that live there, it makes sense. Don't feel you've got to camp or stay at a B&B. An adventure's an adventure regardless of where you stay, in my opinion. Day 2, my plan was to get to York and then get the train back, as I mentioned. The weather was much better on this day than it was the day previously. There is a bit of a slog getting out of Pateley Bridge, but once you've passed that, you end up going through Brimham Rocks, which again I know really well. It's a beautiful place. I'd recommend going there early if you can. It does get quite touristy and busy, especially on weekends. So if you can try and get to Brimham Rocks before the traffic arrives, you'll be glad of it because it does get very busy. You end up then going on a lot of windy B roads, which I'd never been on, funnily enough. There were some new roads to me, even though I'd lived very close to that for a lot of my life, to Ripon. So at Ripon again, I had another stop, refueled, met another couple of bikepackers who we got chatting, and they were doing, I think they were going up to Newcastle actually from Yorkshire, which was an amazing trip. Again, I didn't get your name. I'm really bad with names. You probably know this by now. So if that was you, again, feel free to leave a comment. It'd be good to hear from you and hear how your trip went. Near Ripon, you'll cycle through Fountains Abbey, which is a beautiful part of the world, somewhere again that I know really well, because I actually used to do a lot of riding around there, and I actually also did my first ever triathlon there. It was the Brownlee Super Sprint Triathlon about 10 years ago in my first year of uni, which is making me feel a little bit old now thinking I was at uni 10 years ago. But even so, it was a fantastic event. Back when I used to do triathlons, I was in a lot better shape than I am now. It was nice to reminisce a little bit riding on those roads that I actually did the bike leg of the triathlon on. Now normally you would cycle from Ripon through towns like Borough Bridge over to York. The plan normally is to cross the toll bridge at Aldwark, which is a tiny little village. It's a beautiful little toll bridge that I've ridden on a couple of times as well. But annoyingly, the toll bridge is closed for pretty much all of 2023. So if you're watching this live, it's worth making a note of that because it does require you to make some significant changes to your route. Because of where the river is in that part of Yorkshire, there are only several river crossings, which means that if you can't use the toll bridge, you kind of have to do a bit of a loop to get to York. My plan was to actually do an extended loop and then follow the solar system way from Selby to York and then get the train back. But I realised I was adding about 30 miles onto the route and I was already pretty tired. And seeing as I was just going back to Selby anyway, I decided to just get the train from Hamerton into York, skip that last bit, given that I couldn't actually follow the route to York anyway, and then cycle back and rejoin the route at York the next day. Now day 3, I went back into York and then followed the route over to Bridlington. The weather on day 3 was supposed to rain later on in the day, but probably about 45 minutes into the day, it started chucking it down and it hardly stopped. It stopped for a couple of hours right at the end, but the vast majority of the day was raining. I didn't get as much footage as I wanted because of the rain. That typically happens. You end up having to stop and do a lot of faffing to film, and because it's raining you kind of want to keep going and make up some time. The route actually skirts a lot of towns to get to Bridlington, which is good if you're wanting to stay on these quiet lanes, but it can be a bit irritating if you haven't got lots of food and water with you. If you're planning on just taking bare minimum and minimal equipment, you want to actually refuel at places. So I had to make some slight changes to the routes, which I'll leave in the description as I always do, so that I could stop. So the route actually goes around Driffield. Instead, I followed the main road a little bit, which wasn't great, into Driffield, just so that I could restock, get some lunch, get some food and water, and carry on. That would be my only negative about this route. I absolutely loved this route. It was similar in a way to the Transpennine Trail, which I did last year, which is another coast to coast, a little bit further south in the UK. My only problem with the Transpennine Trail was the first day you end up going through Liverpool and Manchester, and it's not picturesque and it's not ideal and pretty slow as well because of all the bike paths. Whereas the Way of the Roses every day was absolutely fantastic. It had its own personality, it had challenges, it had amazing scenery. So even though I loved the Transpennine Trail, it was one of my favourite trips last year, I think Way of the Roses is even better than that. I made it into Bridlington at the end, and although it was raining, I did feel a great sense of achievement knowing that I'd done another coast to coast. I'm really enjoying these coast to coast trips, especially when they end in Yorkshire, because it means I can get a direct train home to where I live, which means a lot less travel and a lot less faff. At the end of the route, there is another fantastic signpost like there was at Morecambe. I met a couple of other people who'd also done the route. One chap who was waiting for his mates to finish. I think he'd had a pretty serious problem with his bike and had to abandon, so he'd got the train up to meet them at the end, which I thought was pretty cool. Again, third time, I'm really bad with names. I'm so sorry if it was you, but feel free to leave a comment if it was. It'd be good to hear from you. Thank you very much for watching if you've made it this far. Next month, I am going abroad again. I have been looking forward to this trip for a very, very long time. I have visited this country before, but never by bike. It is one of the most stunning places I've ever been to. Let me know your thoughts where you think it might be. But I cannot wait to bring this bikepacking film out. It'll be coming out next month, so stay tuned, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you then.